Good morning, everyone. And I'm just so excited to be here today with such, powerhouses, because you are the frontline warriors in this battle for equity and inclusiveness. And Elena, I've got to start with you, because for the last 8 years, you have been putting out an annual report looking at poverty in Memphis. Help us understand how racial and economic segregation in Memphis plays into that poverty, and how does it compare to the other factors that keep people in poverty in the city?
Racism is a huge factor in Memphis, and it's not something we like to talk about, but the numbers do not lie. For 8 years, I've looked at poverty, and non-Hispanic white poverty tends to be much lower than...
You have a graphic to show us?
I do have a graphic to show you, and this is not specifically poverty, but if you'll bring it up, the data that I want to show you. Poverty is lower for non-Hispanic whites and higher for Hispanics and for African Americans. So there is the graph. And what you can see here is the median household income. This is the money that the family has. For Shelby County, non-Hispanic whites have almost $8,000 more than what the rest of non-Hispanic whites here in the rest of the country. And African Americans have much lower wages. So the disparities in Memphis, in Shelby County, are huge. Shelby County is a great place to be if you are a non-Hispanic white person. You'll move here. But that speaks to the disparities, to the very deep segregation. We still have segregated schools. We have segregated neighborhoods. You can overlay a map of poverty and a racial map on top of each other. They map exactly the same way.
And highest childhood poverty, correct?
Child poverty, almost half the children are in poverty. But this is what is really important. I'm a fan of education. Yay, education. I teach. However, what we've seen is that African Americans have taken advantage of every educational opportunity afforded to them in Shelby County, with gains in college attainment of 1,500%. Yes, that's 2 zeros after the 15. And yet, median wages for African Americans have remained flat at 50%. So what's the impact of education there? None?
Not much.
What else is going on? Because it's not education, it's not lack of education, it's not lack of effort. It's something else.
Justin, I'd like to go to you. Innovate Memphis has done research on this too. What have you found about the distribution of resources in the city, and how do these disparities actually play out on the neighborhood level?
Sure. We've seen that basically there are neighborhoods in the north and the south of Memphis coming close together near downtown and then going sort of parallel to each other, west to east, that haven't seen economic mobility, have not seen change in decades. And that, if you look at redlining maps, as Dr. Delavega mentioned, if you look at the racial demographic map compared with the poverty and economic map, it's the same map, right? So we have communities of color that have suffered from disinvestment for decades, and that has not changed over at least 30 years, if not more, even though, again, educational attainment has changed. So there are issues around connecting resources, capital access, and that's really where the issues lie.
Kendra, you grew up in another very segregated city, the city of Chicago, and your organization's done something really striking recently. You tried to put a price tag on segregation, realizing that people are not going to accept change if they don't understand that inequity is hurting everyone. So what did you find? What is the cost of poverty to the city of Chicago?
Sure, and I think the story is not that dissimilar from what's happening in Memphis. We have stark segregation along lines of race and along lines of color when we look at our communities. And we really wanted to begin to look at how does that play out and how do we bring more people into the conversation we often just talk about segregation in terms of the impacts of poor communities of color, but what does that look like for the rest of the region? And that was really the impetus for doing this study. And we found 3 major findings: lost income, lost lives, and lost potential. So when we think about lost income, the region is actually losing out on $4.4 billion annually.
That's billion with a B.
Billion with a B in lost income. And that's in thinking about currently Chicago is the 5th most segregated by income and by race metropolitan area. So we looked at what would it look like if we brought that segregation levels down just to a median point. And so we were losing that 4.4 billion. As far as homicide rates, we have a 30% higher homicide rate than what we would see if we were at the national median. And then finally, in lost potential, our educational attainment is suffering. So we would see more people being able to attain college-level degrees with a lower segregation rate.
You know, Elena, that number, 4.4 billion, I have done some research on Memphis, and there's an organization, it's called Smart City Memphis. They said that closing the income gap here between whites and people of color would pump an additional $22 billion into the city's gross domestic product. Do your numbers confirm that?
Sounds accurate. We have 239 families with less than $15 an hour on average. So imagine what that would do. Imagine what that would do to restaurants, to shop owners, to the general economic development, to the tax base. We complain about not having a sufficient tax base, but we are quite frankly shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of not being able to even afford a basic city because we've kept so many people under that magical number, $15 an hour. It hurts everybody. If you have any business at all, it would be in your best interest to have more people being able to afford your business. Henry Ford said it, although, almost 100 years ago, and he said, if my workers cannot afford to buy my cars, I'm going to go under. But we seem to have forgotten those lessons. Ford built a really large company, I think, and he knew something we seem to have forgotten, that is, unless you include everybody in the community, everybody is going to suffer. You cannot create great things. Great things require all of us, and they require including all of us. If we don't, we're going to sink. So last century was the American century. What's going to be the 21st century?
And so when it comes to passing a city minimum wage and increasing it,
that's...
No success here. New York's done it, DC's done it, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, all.
And what we see 1 year out is that there is a very positive impact on the economy. Now, we could see the jobs get cut immediately, but a lot of it is reactionary. A lot of it is, but what happens is that businesses really need the workers. They're an important contributor. One of the things that really drives me crazy is when you go to a fast food restaurant, for instance, and people say, well, but that's a burger flipper. Well, news flash, when I go to a fast food restaurant, I go for a flipped burger. That's the value. That's the value. The workers are adding the value for what we want to consume, and yet we're excluding them from the profits and excluding them from participating also in whatever there is good. But workers are needed. And so what happens is that workers are added because they are an important, essential part of the organization, of the corporation, of the enterprise. Without workers, there is no enterprise. And so let's remember, we're building this together. Everybody matters, and everybody should benefit.
Justin, Innovate Memphis, when it comes to the solutions you're looking at, what are you coming up with to increase opportunity on the neighborhood level? And are you freer because, unlike other parts of the Bloomberg Philanthropies, other innovation teams, you operate outside of the city government? Does that give you more ability to innovate and to really move forward more quickly?
I think it does. There are obviously some drawbacks with being outside government. You don't have the authority that government has. But there are a couple benefits that really help the work. One is you can have a different conversation. And you can both address and strip away some of the baggage or the brand even issues that come with talking about government performing for its residents. The other thing is risk. Government, in a lot of cases, is rightfully risk-averse, but in some cases is problematically risk-averse. And as an external nonprofit, we're able to absorb risk, try new things, prototype, and evaluate what works and what doesn't in a very nimble way, but in a way that if it doesn't work, you know what, that was Innovate Memphis. It wasn't City of Memphis, and I think that that's helpful.
What are you doing that's working?
So we work with emergency medical services, and we've tried some new things so that non-emergent patients have access to the healthcare they need, rather than what has been the historic ambulance to the ER. That's obviously not great for health outcomes, but it's also not good for the financial health of the home either. And so we've come up with some different solutions for different non-emergent patient types. And the other thing, and particularly around the conversation change, is we led Transit Vision, which is about how we completely wipe the route map clean in Memphis and start over and envision a new transit system for Memphis.
And why is that so important?
Because people need connections to jobs, healthcare, and all the other things that go to make a healthy, high quality of life. Right now, we don't have many frequent lines at all. We have a coverage map with dispersed coverage all across our 325 square miles. And what we need is a networked map with more frequent lines running not just east and west, but north and south into those neighborhoods I mentioned earlier to connect people to jobs and other opportunities.
Kendra, your organization, after you came up with this report on the cost of poverty, now you're looking at solutions. What are the interventions that you have come up with that are starting to bear fruit? And how difficult is it really pushing the ball forward? There was a fabulous poverty forum here in this very room a year ago. I know that, Elena, you were a part of. And I thought it was so interesting because one of the participants said, the system isn't broken. The system is working just the way it was designed to work. And poverty is not accidental. Poverty persists because someone is profiting from it. So you've got to be facing resistance in Chicago with what you're trying to do. And how are you overcoming that?
I think it's been an interesting time to have this conversation. A lot of things have happened in the past several years in Chicago that I think have made this conversation easier to have than it would have been, because we don't talk about race in Chicago. We all know we're segregated, but nobody says, oh, they just say, don't go past Roosevelt Road. But you don't talk about why you're telling people not to go past Roosevelt Road. It's kind of understood. So I think being able to, the changing administration, the Logjam McDonald cover-up, all those things I think were primers to have this conversation about race. And understanding our study started with looking at segregation and the cost of segregation, but really the root of that segregation is just a byproduct of institutional and structural racism. So we had to be honest and be able to have that conversation. And so one of the primary recommendations that we make in our roadmap, which is a follow-up report to the cost of segregation, is how do we help all sectors embrace a racial equity framework and begin to interrogate their policies and their procedures and look for inequities and what's causing those inequities and begin to make plans to disassemble them. So that's a long, ongoing process. It doesn't happen overnight, but I think some of the victories that we've had have been, being able to make that economic imperative to have these conversations from community-based organizations to corporate boardrooms and actually bring people into conversation about inequities that impact all of us. Working with the city council and with corporate partners, one of the things that we were able to do was introduce an ordinance that would curb the alderman's power to essentially put the kibosh on, zoning approvals, which often impacted affordable housing going in more affluent areas.
So that's having an impact?
It's in city council now. We're having some transition, as you may know. But I think that's been one of the things where in having individual conversations with aldermen, we got a lot more support than we thought we would have, and having those conversations and building that support. We also, you guys may have heard, we have a new mayor coming in about a month or so. So we have an African-American woman mayor for the first time in the city of Chicago. Let's clap for that. And some of the things that she's gotten behind have been really aligned. A lot of the things that she's gotten behind have been aligned with our roadmap. You may have heard of these two mega developments that are coming into Chicago, the 78 and Lincoln Yards. And there's been civic organizations and community-based organizations really pushing to do a racial equity impact assessment on the process for giving TIF funds to those types of projects. And the projects were approved, but the mayor, the elect, has been supportive of really working with those groups to look at the results and the recommendations from that racial equity impact assessment and being able to shape the future negotiations for those two mega development projects. So just having new leadership that's leading from a racial equity standpoint, I think has been really exciting for us. Again, continuing to have these conversations to pull in all parties. It's not easy. It's not an easy conversation to have. Everyone's not necessarily drinking the Kool-Aid. And I think the danger, too, is to some degree, in some circles, equity has become the new buzzword. So how do you make sure that it's not just a fad, it's just not a bandwagon that people are jumping into, but it's really meaningful, sustainable change.
Right. Elena, before we go to the audience for questions, you, again, have been putting out this report for 8 years, and I can imagine it's been frustrating to see the needle just move a little bit, the progress be so incremental. What are the solutions that you see that you think will really break the logjam?
So yes, the needle has not moved much, and it doesn't, and in part it doesn't, and it's been mentioned here before. The system is it's not broken, but it's benefiting somebody. And so it's working to a great degree for certain people. What do we need to do? I think we need to recognize that the system is unfair. And what we need to do is think as a community, be a lot more cohesive. We need to think about those wages. We need to think about how bringing 200,000 people out of the poverty is going to have a tremendous impact on the economic life of the community. We should all be advocating for those $15. If we don't pay people enough, that's when we have to give them so-called welfare. And again, it's been mentioned before that welfare is what we all receive. There is a very, very interesting paper by Mimi Abramovitz in the 1990s, and then she rewrote it again in 2001, and she says everybody's on welfare. And that's absolutely true. We're all on welfare. Well, did you get on a public road this morning? I did. I also ate food inspected by the FDA. Yes. And there are also tax breaks and using your home office and mileage free, all of those things. Everybody gets welfare, but we don't call it welfare. So let's think about how we can be more effective in being a cohesive community. $15 an hour is a start. Certainly not enough, but it's a start. And we should all get behind that. We should always also think when we go to the ballot box, is this going to be, am I voting because of maybe racism that I haven't acknowledged, deep-seated fears? Do we vote for fear? Do we vote for hope? Do we vote for all? Are these inclusive policies, or are these policies that are going to benefit just a few? Why am I doing what I'm doing? So we have to be a lot more inclusive. We have to think about things that will benefit us all. Ultimately, individually, we may be doing fine, but we're not doing as well as we could do if we were all included. And we have to think about so the wages is the first one. Public transportation? Yes. If people cannot get to work, they cannot work. This is just it's basic, right? Public transportation, comprehensive, efficient, something everybody wants to use. Jane Jacobs said in the 1960s that integrated communities work better for everybody because the services that are provided are acceptable to the middle class. And what we need is an integrated community. By the way, where is the low-income housing in Crosstown Concourse? If anybody can answer that one for me, please, thank you.
Well,
So
Elena, I know you could go on and on.
I
wanna
could
give
go
our
on
audience-
forever.
I want to give our audience a chance to chime in. If you would, stand up and identify yourself when you ask a question. And we got one back here.
Okay, I am Dr. Keith D. Lee, and my question is related to the first panel as well as to this one. There seems to be a lot of focus on poverty and $15 wages, and we seem to have let the companies and the universities off the hook. Could you speak to that? Because there are few black faculties at universities, there are few black executives at the companies here. So how does that also contribute to this ongoing poverty?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I've spoken a lot, but it all contributes to it. And yes, all the universities have a responsibility to pay people living wages. All of us have a responsibility to pay people living. It's all of us. Every one of us has a responsibility to promote that. Yes, the universities do too, and the big companies do too. Nobody is off the hook, and nobody gets a pass. I thought we had outlawed slavery, yes, with the 13th Amendment. So slavery wages are a problem. We all have a responsibility, and when we benefit from low wages, we have to think, am I a participant in this exploitation?
Justin, did you want to chime in, or Kendra?
I'll just say, I think this is similar to the issue around the TIF reform that we're looking at with these huge mega developments where over $3 billion in city subsidies are going to private development. And so this is a call to interrogate the process. You know, why are we giving so much away? What are we asking for? How much affordable housing are we getting? Where is the MBE, WBE participation in this project? So these are the questions that I think the racial equity assessment is surfacing, and some negotiation has already gone on with the mayor-elect around more participation. But we have to ask those questions at the beginning of these processes. We can't just wait and see and hope that people are going to actually do what's in the best interest of the whole community.
Mm-hmm.
All right, another question back here.
Hi, Gary Rosenfeld. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Memphis Transit Authority. Thank you for all your comments. You know, the key to it in our community can be boiled down to something that's very simple. Capitalism is not about hoarding money, it's about churning money. The more money, it's about how much money you make, not how much money you have. Mm-hmm. If we were to successfully move 100,000 of the 230,000 people that are below the poverty line that you mentioned into an average wage job as presented by the past census, which is only $10.99 an hour, and we were to apply a very conservative respend rate of just 3 when transit projects are typically 5 or higher, that would move $6 billion a year around our community. So picture what would happen if you were to drop an extra $1 billion in the communities in the north end of the city or the south end of the city or any part of the city for that matter.
So how do we make that happen?
We invest in public transportation.
We agree.
Yes.
All right, there was more of a statement than a question, but thank you very much. And did we have one more question? I think we have time back here.
Jeffrey Lichtenstein, Memphis AFL-CIO Labor Council. I appreciate some of the comments about raising wages, and unfortunately some of the tools of city and county government to intervene in the employee-employer relationship have been curtailed by the Republican supermajority at the state with preemption laws. So I wonder if there are thoughts from the panel about what tools still remain even after the ability to raise a minimum wage has been actually taken from Memphis, whereas it was never taken from the city of New York or Seattle, particularly when it comes to development, as that's one of the topics today, and whether, in addition to minority and women-owned businesses, goals for contractors that provide a minimum wage or a minimum job quality would be helpful in this conversation.
So how do you overcome that intervention from Nashville?
I'll let you go first because I've spoken a lot.
I mean, it's a great question, and it's something that's very layered. I mean, that type of policy tension exists not just around labor, but also housing, neighborhood condition, access to capital, all sorts of things. I mean, I think that any government entity, particularly a local government entity, has a couple responsibilities. One, it's just about leadership. What do we stand for? What are we going to speak to? What are we going to ask everyone to, I guess, to serve as a convener around the conversation. But also, I think, secondly, who do you do business with and what do they pay their employees? Who do you subsidize and what do they pay their employees? Who do you grant fund and what do they pay their employees? And how much do you pay your employees? And I think those 4 aspects of how your money's spent and how they ultimately pay their employees, if they're partners, are really the leverage you have when the state is trying to do so much to block your agency.
Elena, briefly, you get the last word.
So yes, we need to, as a city, we don't have as much power as, we don't think we have as much power. But we have power, we need to speak up, we need to go vote, we need to vote being really thoughtful about it. Let's not vote because of fear. Let's vote for what is good for the community. Let's vote with hope. Let's vote for a better world for everybody. And really, the option, if we continue having this tremendous inequality, disparities, is going to be a total systems collapse and revolution. Nobody wants that. Let's work together.
And we're going to have to, right, because we will become a majority nation of color by 2045, so we've got to figure this out. Join me in thanking this wonderful panel, Elena, Justin, Kendra. Thank you.